Before we begin this video, I know Sakura made a lost episode Creepypasta Iceberg, but I can confirm this one is definitely different, so stick around. Watch his videos too though. Also, thank you guys so much for 20,000 subs. I'm honestly hoping to hit 25k by the end of the year, so if you enjoyed this, make sure to leave a like and sub. Let's get into it, and thanks for watching. Creepypasta. Coming from the words creepy and copypasta, is a genre of internet horror stories and urban legends that have unknown origin. Some think this genre began with chain emails, others think it began with Ted the Caver, a very famous story commonly associated with creepypasta that came out in 2001. Regardless of when or where you think they came from, one thing is obvious: creepypasta are extremely popular. With that level of popularity, of course, comes a large base of people wanting to participate. This caused creepypasta to delve into a bunch of different subjects, from video games to rituals to real-world events. One other thing they've covered are cartoons and television shows. Today, we'll be covering lost episode creepypastas. Creepypasta is about a mysterious episode of your favorite kids show that just isn't right. Something you swear you saw at 3 AM on TV yet nobody else did. From SpongeBob to Scooby-Doo, we'll be covering every single topic in the lost episode Creepypasta Iceberg by Midnight and Pen and Hex Studios, linked in the description and pinned comment as usual. This is the lost episode Creepypasta Iceberg Explained. Squidward's / Red Mist. First, I'll cover the Squidward story before I go into the overall concept of Red Mist. The aforementioned creepypasta is from the perspective of a former intern at Nickelodeon Studios. While working there in 2005, they were able to work directly with directors and animators, allowing them to see episodes before they aired. While in the editing room with 2 other interns, they received an episode that was supposed to be Fear of a Krabby Patty. When turning this tape in, it led with a title card reading Squidward's, which was a bit odd but was thought to be a work-related joke as they'd had mock title cards before. After the episode starts as normal, SpongeBob is outside annoying Squidward while he's trying to play his clarinet, a trope typical in the show. Squidward yells at SpongeBob to keep it down since he has a concert that night and needs to practice. SpongeBob says okay and leaves before a bubble transitions to the concert. Immediately something is wrong, as the animation is repeating frames while the sound isn't. As typical of the show, the crowd begins to boo Squidward. Only this time there's much more realistic malice in the booing, as if they're real people who genuinely hate the person performing. The crowd's eyes are also hyper-realistic. Trust me, you'll be hearing that term a few times throughout this iceberg, looking nearly identical to the eyes of real people, although still clearly drawn. The next scene shows Squidward on his bed, clearly sad. As the night sky shone through his window, he sat there sadly blinking in complete silence for around 30 seconds. He then began to cry, and cried for a full minute more before a very quiet breeze sound played in the background. He began to sob loudly with more and more emotion as the screen slowly zoomed in on his face, the sound quality being notably high at this point. A laugh begins to play in the background, coming in at short intervals. After this, the screen twitches and blurs while something flashes across the screen for a split second. After the lead animation editor rewound it frame by frame, they realized that the image was that of a... It goes back to Squidward with running down his eyes. It's very hyper-realistic to the point that it feels like you could reach out and get some on your hand. Wind and sounds of snapping branches played louder, a deep laugh playing in frequent intervals. Again, the screen twitches and flashes an image, and it was the same as before, though a different person. Everything soon went silent, and Squidward stared at the screen with hyper-realistic eyes. At this point, the deep voice laughing and wind sound comes back, as well as another picture similar to the last two. Eventually, after they call Steven Hillenburg, rest in peace, to see the episode, they continue to see Squidward is again silently staring at the viewer. A voice in his head begins to tell him to do it, and Squidward pulls out a... He then proceeds to graphically end his own life. Afterwards, Squidward is shown laying on his bed, destroyed. After this, the story is wrapped up by saying that they ended up having to watch it a second time, and after further investigation, it's unknown who edited the tape. Red Mist is the tape that this lost episode came on, allegedly made by a Scottish animator. So you may be asking a few questions at this point. How can someone so accurately voice act Squidward and the original voice actor not be involved? How could someone have snuck that tape in with no security camera footage? And maybe even, how could one surpass the limits of current technology at the time? And to you I say, there's absolutely no point in asking any of that because there simply isn't any logical plot in any of these stories. So, don't think too hard and enjoy the ride. Bart. According to the narrator, the cause of the odd way that The Simpsons counts episodes traces back to a lost episode from season 1. This alleged episode was written entirely by Matt Groening. When asked about it, Groening would allegedly act very emotional, apparently trembling when the narrator brought it up and being near on the verge of tears. After handing him a website address, Groening leaves and the narrator proceeds to visit the site and download the file. The file was the worst virus the narrator had seen, and the computer was forced to be fully wiped and rebooted. However, conveniently, they backed the file up onto a CD before the reboot. Why they do this after getting such a terrible virus from it, who knows. After the episode started, it was apparent that it was more amateur than a typical season 1 episode. The animation was poor quality and unstable. To quote the narrator, "If you've seen the original animation for Some Enchanted Evening, it was similar but less stable. Every character was a bit off for the time, Homer being angrier, Marge being more depressed, Lisa being more anxious, and Bart being more genuinely angry and hateful. The Simpsons go on a plane trip, and on said plane, Bart decides to break a window after it begins to take off, getting him sucked out. Afterwards, it showed his," which was extremely realistic, nearly photorealistic in fact. After this, the second act started, showing Homer, Marge, and Lisa crying at the kitchen table. They cried for the entire act, and the animation was decaying as it went on. After this, a title card appears saying 1 year's passed, and a skeletally thin Marge, Homer, and Lisa are sitting at the table. They go to visit Bart, and at his gravesite they begin to cry as his body is laying in front of his tombstone. Eventually, they stop and stare at his body before the camera zooms in on Homer and he makes a joke, which the narrator claims is inaudible. The camera then zooms out and shows other gravestones, many naming Simpsons guest stars and the dates of their passing. Some, like Michael Jackson and George Harrison, were accurate. The final image was a hyper-realistic version of the Simpsons sitting on the couch. The narrator then realizes when going back that all the other guest stars' death dates on their tombstones were the exact same day. Mouse.avi. There's a lot of old Disney cartoons that are still released on DVD and such in the modern age. According to the narrator of this story, this is one of those episodes. Apparently, it opens up with Mickey solemnly walking in a loop for 6 minutes while incoherent banging on a piano plays in the background. It then cuts to black for a few minutes before it begins to show Mickey walking again. This time there was a murmuring or gurgling, no specific language but a general sound. The sidewalk begins to warp into impossible directions as the sound continues to get louder. Mickey's mouth begins to curl up into a smirk as the murmuring turns into a scream. Colors that should have been impossible begin to appear, and the buildings begin to float in midair as the sidewalk continues to warp and shift directions. It suddenly and abruptly cuts to Mickey's face with a broken music box playing in the background. The last 30 seconds isn't known by the author, but one person that watched the tape left the room and exclaimed, "Real suffering is not known," several times before taking his own life. The only other information about the clip is a final frame with Russian that states, "The sights of hell bring its viewers back in." The Grieving. One night at 4 a.m., a mysterious episode of The Amazing World of Gumball was announced during the Adult Swim block on Cartoon Network. Although it was odd that an episode of a kids show would be coming on at this time, the narrator paid no mind to it. The intro wasn't animated and looked as if a child had drawn it. The title card stated, "The Grieving." It started with Gumball looking miserable in the corner of his dimly lit classroom. It eventually switches over to Gumball's house, his dad Richard looking somber while wearing a black suit. He began to sob while sitting on the sofa. It's at this point that the narrator points out that the animation was more sloppy and amateur. Nicole, Gumball's mother, steps into the living room wearing a black dress and hat and sits down to comfort Richard. Eventually, after a long period of Richard crying, it shifts back to the school where Richard and Nicole are dressed normally and talking to Principal Brown. This is clearly back in time. The principal tells them that Anais and Darwin, two of the kids, weren't present after lunch and nobody had any idea where they were. Nicole becomes furious and spouts various obscenities at him before he let them know the devastating news. Darwin and Anais were found, however they were no longer alive. He excruciatingly describes how they were found, causing a flashback. In this flashback, he details how they initially called the police, thinking something bad had happened to them considering their reputation wouldn't cause one to think that they were skipping on purpose. Anais was the first to be found, her head being spotted in a small box outside. Of course, this was drawn extremely realistic, hyper-realistic if you'd rather. A note in the box led to further remains in Darwin's body as well. Every single image in these scenes were extremely detailed as said before, and the narrator noted that every single detail had been expertly shown. As a commercial aired, the narrator looked the episode up and found nothing. They also called their brother and told them to check it out, however their brother just claimed that Looney Tunes was on. They were shocked and attempted to turn the TV off, however nothing worked. Realizing they somehow couldn't escape due to their bedroom and bathroom being locked from the outside, they decided to call the cops. However, before they can do that, they drop their phone into a cup of Pepsi. At this point, they're forced to finish the episode. Back to the show, Nicole finally asks the principal if Gumball is okay, and Principal Brown claims that he was out sick. This causes Nicole and Richard distress as Richard informs him that he was supposed to have gotten on the bus that day. He was later found in his teacher Miss Simeon's room. The episode ended showing Gumball just there as the screen faded out. After the credit sequence, several graphic and creepy videos were shown, and at this point the narrator passes out. After waking up, everything was unlocked and the TV was off. The police were called, and after they came, they found nothing at all. The narrator's little brother also heard about the episode and passed out as well. Eventually they found out that their own little brother had gone missing and that their parents were major suspects. After a bunch of sleuthing, they eventually contacted the creator of Gumball, who claims that he made it as a joke despite an old co-worker but got rid of it a long time ago. However, the graphic elements weren't a part of his version of the episode. He concludes by stating he theorizes that found the tape and modified it himself before broadcasting it, and says that he truly doesn't have a concrete explanation and that he's sorry. Gregory's room. The narrator wanted to be a cartoon tester as a kid in the 90s. His parents eventually were contacted by people that would allow him to be a cartoon tester, and they set everything up. After going to Nickelodeon HQ, he walked into a room with 5 other kids and a DVD player. It was very similar to a living room. A man walked in and claimed that they would be trying a new show out on Nick Jr. After putting a DVD in, the TV played static for a bit. Eventually it showed a fireplace before a crude CGI man was shown sitting on the couch facing the night sky. He says, "Oh, I didn't see you there," before the camera turns around and he says, "Hello, I'm Gregory and this is my room." The camera zooms in on his face. He says, "We're gonna have so much fun together, just the 2 of us." He then exclaims that they could do things like look at the stars and read a book together. It then goes silent and it zooms in on Gregory as he states that nobody will be there except for the viewer and him, and that nobody will be able to help them. As he gets closer and closer, distorted background music plays and Gregory says that he needs love. This causes the kids to cry and scream, and the man comes in and angrily lets the kids out. The narrator snuck the DVD out and claims that they were hoping to understand such a creation. Candle Cove. In an internet forum, different people are discussing an odd 1970s puppet show they watched called Candle Cove. It was on channel 58 and involved a girl named Janice and her adventures on the laughingstock with her pirate friends like Pirate Percy. Whenever a creepy place popped up, the ship would always tell Percy, "You have to go inside." There was also a villain known as the Skin Taker along with his sidekick Horace Horrible. The Skin Taker was a marionette that appeared as a dirty skeleton with a brown top hat and cape. When Janice would ask, "Why does your mouth move like that?" he would respond, "To grind your skin." There was also apparently a screaming episode where Janice and everyone else just screamed and cried with no plot. Eventually someone on the forum says that they visited their mom in the nursing home and asks if she remembers Candle Cove. She responds that she remembers that they would tell her that they were going to watch Candle Cove and sit down in front of a TV playing only static for 30 minutes. 1999. On a channel known as Caledon Local 21, an odd character named Mr. Bear ran a series of different crude kids shows in his cellar. At first they were a bit odd, but as time went on they became outright disturbing. For example, in the beginning he had episodes where he would oddly yet passively interact with kids, something clearly off but not blatantly wrong. However, eventually episodes just had him outright the kids. As the narrator watched it day by day in the year of 1999, he eventually wanted to visit Mr. Bear, as Mr. Bear offered his watchers to write him and they'd exchange letters, with Mr. Bear stating that he'd like to see him. Their dad took them, but after noticing how sketchy the place was, he decided not to let him go in. Eventually it's revealed that Mr. Bear was a deranged man who led a cult, who performed certain rituals and sacrifices. The kids were actually being used for these. As the narrator continues to investigate and learn more about this horrific individual, we eventually hit a sudden cliffhanger and there are no further updates. Rap Rat. An odd VHS board game called Rap Rat was released in the 90s. The narrator and his family played this game, and although the character was a bit odd looking, it was what the character did that changed their life forever. Rap Rat would shout at them demonically before many different images showing their fears would flash on the screen, with Rap Rat's face faintly overlaying them, a scratching noise playing in the background. The narrator ran into their room and eventually left the memory behind, until they were much older and found the game again. This time they played it again to show their girlfriend how bad it was, and it was even worse this time. Rap Rat began twisting and convulsing after the disturbing images and videos were shown, as the scratching got louder and louder, and eventually turned to thumping like paws on a wooden floor. The narrator eventually turns the VHS off and all sound stops. Their neighbor had seen a figure outside of their door, which prompted the police to be called. They ended up destroying the tape, but the trauma and nightmares continued. Eventually, after being tormented by Rap Rat, they decided to get to the bottom of this game. Apparently, for the rat model and other things, the company used a sweatshop in Haiti. Of course, due to poor work environment, a girl was accidentally, and her mother cursed the game at her daughter's funeral with a fear demon called Apparat. There are a few words of warning after this. One is to never say Apparat out loud. If you do this, it is an invitation for them to come and it cannot be undone. 2. Do not try to contact Apparat. And 3. Avoid being awake between 3:30 and 4 a.m. They end this story by saying somehow the VHS has come back and did not let Rap Rat trick you. Happy Appy. This is a story that was purposely written to be horrible about a kid's show that was supposedly on Noggin. It involves an apple named Happy Appy, and this apple goes from seemingly normal kids topics like boo-boos to episodes that are much more like a Stick episode, or much more disturbing, like a 9/11 episode. The story continues to get crazier and crazier as more and more bonus content is found, as well as a real-life oddity that begins to stalk the creator. Honestly, this story will take like 3 hours to read, so if you want to read something that's supposed to be bad for that long, be my guest. Plankton got served. I'm sure most of you have seen SpongeBob, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen an episode called One Course Meal, one of the more disturbing ones in the franchise. But did you know that this episode wasn't exactly the original copy? According to this creepypasta, it's not. The episode apparently came out on the internet before TV, and this caused the original version to accidentally be uploaded first. The narrator, being a huge SpongeBob fan, was quickly refreshing the Nick site when the episode showed up. It was called Plankton Got Served. At first, everything is more or less identical to the current episode, with Plankton catching Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob in the kitchen and tying them up, about to get the formula from SpongeBob right before Mr. Krabs' daughter Pearl walks in. Plankton is scared of Pearl as his ancestors were eaten by whales, and Mr. Krabs decides to take advantage of this fear, tormenting Plankton with it until Plankton decides to lie in the street and wait on a bus to come and squash him. This is all the same as in the current episode that you can watch now. In the current version, Plankton ends up being told that Mr. Krabs is actually dressing up as Pearl to scare him. He gets up from the road and the episode continues. However, in the original, Plankton allegedly stays in the road and watches the bus hit him as the screen fades to black. Plankton is now standing on a plank with darkness below him and light above him. Below him are whales, with his ancestors also down there encouraging him to jump down. Eventually, he takes the plunge and the episode ends. Crybaby Lane. Crybaby Lane is a pretty popular piece of lost media when it comes to kids' movies and shows. However, the creator claims that the original version is something that you'll never see. The creator, Peter Lauer, allegedly suggested and performed many insane and disturbing ideas, most of which I can't get into. Eventually, it got to the point where he was showing the room graphic pictures to inspire them, and at this point the narrator quit attempting to work on the production altogether. The narrator then implies that Crybaby Lane influenced many major cartoon shows, with Lauer wanting a squirrel to be in a jar relating to the SpongeBob episode Tea at the Tree Dome, coming on not soon after, and a man with a squid-like nose being the inspiration for Squidward, as well as other shows like a man capturing souls and sending them to Hades being the inspiration for Danny Phantom. SpongeBob bootleg tape. The image you're seeing on screen was from a corrupted bootleg tape of the SpongeBob episode Dumped. The rest of the episode is more or less a jumbled mess, completely unrecognizable. 5 urban exploring teens originally found the tape in a trash can within an abandoned mental institution. Of the 5, 2 have taken their own lives, 1 is missing, 1 won't speak about the tape, and the last one handed the tape over when being investigated about what happened to the other 4. The person who handed the tape over was later found just a year later. Some claim that when looking at the image for long enough, they see SpongeBob blink. Tom's Basement. A long time ago, Czechoslovakian director Gene Deitch made a series of Tom and Jerry shorts. The narrator of the story states that Gene didn't really want to make them, but felt forced. This caused him to make the episodes much worse in order to make the people who watched them suffer. Apparently, although he released 13 shorts, he was supposed to have done more. This is about one of the unreleased ones. The episode opens up with Tom's angry owner on his tail for sleeping in front of the basement. He tells him he can never go down there and Tom runs away. While back beside the basement, Jerry comes out and has a much more grotesque model than usual. Eventually, as the episode goes on, it follows the typical formula, but every injury Tom receives is realistic and leaves lasting effects. Tom eventually begs Jerry to leave him alone. Jerry takes no pity and pushes him down the basement stairs, the action that's caused him to get hurt by his owner numerous times at this point. The owner goes ballistic and Jerry decides to take pity on Tom and the owner. Afterward, they carry him down the basement stairs and they find tons of other bodies as well. Jerry then Tom and leaves him down there as well before putting up a for sale sign. Tom and Jerry VHS. During house cleaning, the narrator ends up finding a copy of Tom and Jerry on VHS, something that he wanted ever since he was a little kid. When asking his mom why he'd never gotten it, she revealed that it was from his late aunt who was during a break-in. After his mom left to go on a date with his now stepdad, he decided to watch the VHS, which had an episode titled Of the French. Tom, Jerry, and Nibbles were the 3 musketeers. The episode revolves around the king asking Tom to keep the noise down and let him sleep. The narrator immediately notices while rewinding the tape that the show is much more graphic and detailed than before. When Tom is eventually brought to the guillotine in the episode, instead of a sound of metal hitting wood and nothing else, you get to see him being led to the guillotine as the crowd chants, "End it, do it now," among other things. Eventually his life is ended very graphically. It then ends up cutting to an episode where Tom is in the afterlife. The ticket collector states that Tom will have to go to the underworld if he hasn't received forgiveness from Jerry, and when he hasn't, the ticket collector's voice gets much deeper and he simply says, "I'm sorry, Tom," before Tom falls down into a pit. He ended up in a cauldron screaming as the devil, otherwise known as Spike the Bulldog, poked him with a pitchfork and left lasting injuries. Eventually, after turning off the tape and falling asleep, the narrator wakes up unable to find it again. He finds out that it's been donated to Goodwill, and when he gets there, they claim it's already been sold. He says at the end of the story that he's still looking for the tape to this day. Rugrats, Chuckie's mom. While everyone knows Rugrats, barely anyone knows of Rugrascals, the more dark adult show that the creator also wanted to air. Due to the pilot being too disturbing, it was rejected by pretty much everyone. However, a station in New Zealand accidentally played the pilot known as Chuckie's Mom. The episode is relatively normal and begins with the babies talking about their moms. Chuckie has a flashback to his mom and remembers standing next to her while she was in a hospital bed singing to him. When she got to the second verse of the song, it began to play in reverse, and it then showed a chicken getting with a shot of Chuckie in front of it. Chuckie turns around and screams, and his mother has a man's live action mouth on her face. She says, "Don't worry, Chuckie, it's time for me to move on," before it shows different disturbing images like a cow walking into a box titled, or footage of the LA riots. Chuckie continues to scream this whole time, and eventually sonograms are shown. The voice of Chuckie's mom comes in and says, "Aren't you a lucky ducky, Chuckie?" before a Harlequin fetus appears. Eventually, Chuckie has a seizure, and the scene shows reality, the ambulance worker trying to help him as the other kids cry. At the end, a photo of a kid that looks like Chuckie appears, screaming as the camera zooms into him and the episode ends. Max and Ruby 0004. After getting a random package pushed through your letterbox, you may not want to open it, especially if it seems dirty and worn down, unless you're the narrator of this story. To them, it was great since they needed to get something for their 4-year-old cousin anyway and were still attempting to buy a Max and Ruby DVD. Although the DVD looked crude and the episodes were labeled in an odd way, they actually played fine and everything went well. After giving it to their cousin, they forgot about it until they had to babysit them on Boxing Day. All of a sudden, while in the kitchen cooking, they heard their cousin scream. After they rushed into their cousin's room, they saw what they claimed to have been one of the most horrifying things they'd ever seen. It was Max and Ruby, with no eyes, nose, or mouth, standing in a dark room and facing the camera. The Max and Ruby theme was faintly playing in the background as well. Eventually, after calming their cousin down and convincing them it was a dream, the narrator went back to watch the episode more closely. The episode 0004 title had been replaced with RIP Mommy and Daddy. At first, Max and Ruby were just playing tag in the garden and their parents were watching them play. The mother and father looked sad as the music played in reverse. Eventually, the father speaks, saying, "It's such a shame." It then cuts to loud static and screaming before playing the sound of two people choking, apparently sounding so realistic that it made the narrator sick. The scene then switches to Max and Ruby standing in front of a gravestone labeled RIP Mommy and Daddy, both of them having no face. Both Max and Ruby are shown sobbing next, their sobs sounding extremely realistic. Max is then standing on a chair with a hanging down from the ceiling. He then places it around his neck. It then shows Ruby walking in and witnessing the event. She screams and the same choking sound from before starts playing. Her face remains on the screen for 5 minutes before she finally begins to cry. Ruby was now in front of two graves, the second one being labeled Rip Brother. In the end, there was a picture that was labeled, "Is our only release." Days later, they heard someone push something through the door. This letter had the same phrase as the end of the episode. Gurgles and Bug Men. As a kid, the narrator of this story was underprivileged and thus spent a lot of time by themselves as their parents worked really hard to make ends meet. During this time they would spend by themselves, they would use old toys and such that the family owned. One of these things was an old TV set. It had a glass screen that curved out and was wooden. Most channels didn't work, but one did. This channel shows the Gurgles and Bug Men show. This candid camera type show involves the very creepy duo of Gurgles and Bug Men as they would hide in people's houses and play pranks on them. Gurgles was a really creepy looking clown, while Bugman was more or less an eldritch horror creature with its sideways mouth and huge eyes. At first they would move around random items in the house, the laugh track playing every time they did something. Eventually, as they continued, the people would go to sleep. After they fell asleep, Bugman would softly and silently sneak into their room and onto their bed before sticking a sharp straw like appendage from his mouth into their neck. This would successfully paralyze them, and then Bugman would begin to drink from their neck. During this time, the laughter and clapping was especially loud, and after the victim was finished, clapping and cheering would occur. Bugman would look at the camera and say, "See you again soon." One day the TV disappeared, and the narrator ended up finding out that this was because his friend was a victim of the show. The narrator ends the story by wondering if Bugman and Gurgles are still making their show, and if so, who their next victim could be. Timothy's Bad Week. On YouTube, a lot of people have fun editing cartoon footage. Sometimes it ends up being a meme, and other times it ends up being more of an urban legend. Timothy's Bad Week is one of the latter. If you've ever heard of Timothy Goes to School, you'll know it's about a raccoon that attends school with a bunch of other anthropomorphic animals. I personally enjoyed the show a lot as a kid. The narrator of this story claims that they found a video on YouTube called Timothy's Bad Week. Thinking it was nothing more than a horribly edited creepypasta, they decided to watch it. The video began in black and white with poor image quality as the characters stared with completely white eyes. The video cut to black and the text on screen read, Monday. Timothy waited at the bus stop, the crude animation still playing in black and white, and everyone's eyes still completely white. After Timothy got on the bus, every character was clearly different. Yoko the cat was more angry, both the Frank bulldogs were fighting, Doris the beaver was larger and being bullied by Fritz the badger and Claude the raccoon, and the mouses... Why'd I say mouses? The mice, Nora and Charles, held hands and silently stared forward, and Lily the fox sat in the back clearly upset, missing a shoe and having notable bruises. The screen then turned black and it showed Tuesday. Everyone was more injured, more violent, or more afraid, including Timothy. Wednesday is the same, however. Charles the mouse has disappeared. Thursday shows one of the Franks, Yoko, and Nora missing, as well as Fritz and Claude hanging their heads in shame. Lily has also gotten to the point where she's covered in mud and bruises among other injuries and was rocking back and forth singing Kookaburra Sits in the Old Gum Tree. Friday, the song continued to play, however at this point Timothy was on crutches and only Fritz and Claude were on the bus. After Timothy looks at them, he walks over and sits down as the episode fades out and the song plays one last time. The narrator saves the link to play a prank on his friend, but when he shows his friend the link, it plays a normal episode. At this point he's confused. Eventually he reveals that he's still attempting to find the episode and doesn't know where it went, and who knows, you may find it too. Doug's Real Life. In fall 2005 at 6 a.m. for 5 days, the show Doug aired as a comeback. At least, that's what the narrator of this story claims. After wanting to watch Doug due to dreaming about it, but not having any idea of how they would be able to do so, Nick conveniently happened to have a 5-day period in which the show would re-air. The first 4 days were normal, but the 5th was not. The 5th day's episode started relatively normally, although the characters never showed up, unlike in the real intro. The next scene opened up with Doug silently writing in his journal in a dark room. Unlike usual, he didn't narrate over himself writing, he just sat there and wrote. Soon the scene faded out and in faded the title, which read Doug's Real Life. And then starts the actual episode with Doug worrying about a test since he hadn't studied for it. The screen randomly flashed during his family's conversation, but the narrator couldn't make out what it was. Doug eventually left the house, and while walking, he had a fantasy about things going wrong like he usually does. Only this time, when people laughed at him after he was told he flunked the test, it sounded crueler than usual. The screen flashed again when Doug got to school, and the animation style changed to a darker look. After Doug walked through the hallway and sat down, the animation returned to normal. The scene abruptly changed after school, and Doug walked home worrying about the test. After arriving home, he began to talk to his dog Pork Chop when the screen flashed. Pork Chop turned into a hunk of rotting meat, and Doug's house became decrepit. Though nobody was there, Doug continued to act like there were people in the house. After he sat down at an empty table, the screen flashed and his family was there eating with him. The phone rang and Doug's mom answered it. Doug immediately thought he'd failed the test and had a fantasy in which his parents got giant and their faces twisted into a dark red. The screen then flashed again and the house was empty. Doug now crying and apologizing to nobody. Doug ventured upstairs and walked into his bedroom, which had nothing but a book and a pencil. He began to write and narrated this time. He said, "I can't tell which one is real." Not long enough. Remember that Simpsons Lost episode Creepypasta from earlier? This takes place in the same universe. In 1999, Groening was allegedly under a lot of stress from making both The Simpsons and Futurama and decided to do an episode where he did all of the writing himself, similar to The Simpsons creepypasta. Though his staff remembered the prior incident and was a bit horrified, the Futurama team didn't seem to know and thought it would be fine for him to make it. At the start of the episode, Fry, Leela, and Bender were making a delivery as usual. They didn't specify what it was and were upset for unknown reasons. They were also angry at Fry, who continued to apologize but was completely ignored by them. They arrived at a planet that only had one house with a ton of fields on all sides. They eventually walked up to the door and an old alien opened up. He took the box without a word. The box contained a sword and with it himself. The crew was unfazed and flew back home. Fry continued to apologize and they glared at him in silence. Fry sighed and separated from them, walking in his own direction and eventually entered the cryogenics building. He set one of the tubes to an extremely long number and got inside. The screen faded out and faded in, completely focused on Fry. Some bones were poking through his skin and his skin decayed in some places. He mumbled, "It's what I deserve," before getting out of the machine. He walked through a surreal void for a while until he found a picture of him, Bender, and Leela. He looked at it and began to cry. Not long after, the pic turned to dust and Fry continued to walk. Eventually, the camera started to zoom out until it was just a tiny piece of the pupil in Fry's eye. His body had fallen out of the freezing unit and was lying on the floor in the abandoned room. He was drawn in the same hyper-realistic fashion as Bart was in the prior creepypasta. Bender and Leela found him and Leela said he got what he deserved. She then checked her watch and realized it was time to make their next delivery. She took a knife out of her pocket, put it in a box, and then left. Turn the crank. I'm sure a lot of us tried to watch shows and movies our parents didn't want us to. If you're like the narrator of this story, you may have tried to watch Adult Swim especially. As a 6-year-old kid, the narrator really wanted to do everything he wasn't supposed to. Of course, this included watching things his mom didn't want him to. After getting in trouble for disobeying, he vowed not to watch Adult Swim again. That was until his dad came home and he was able to stay up and watch it because his dad was much more lenient. After watching regular Adult Swim programming, it suddenly switched to a movie presentation. The movie started with a girl with purple hair walking around in the rain, droplets of purple rolling down her skin. She resembled an electrical outlet with slits for eyes and odd wiry appendages. The camera panned up to a glass window, and through this window was a man that resembled Santa Claus. He was sitting at a table that had an old record player sitting at it. He began saying, "Turn the crank, and the camera showed him slowly turning it. He continued to keep turning it until the record player cracked up and fell apart, and at this point he began to more or less dissolve into glass. The camera showed the glass covering everything and the girl laying down, likely not alive anymore. The scene then changed to an hourglass and slowly pulled away from it. The narrator, or maybe the Santa guy, not sure, it's not really clarified, says, "She's perfectly fine, now don't you fret. Thanks for watching my show, kids, but you're not out of hell yet." The narrator screamed at this point, which woke his dad up and caused him to change the channel. When his dad changed the channel, however, it changed to Adult Swim. When he changed it back, it said that the program was unauthorized. The narrator found this odd as he never changed the channel and didn't notice it changing. Regardless, he never did find the movie again and still wonders what it is. The Black Friday incident. Toy Story is one of the most beloved, fun, and innocent films that you can think of. However, prior to its final version, it wasn't always that way. Pixar, stressed out by Disney's constant message of "give the film more edge, revise it again," was working insanely hard to continually redo the movie and make it the way Disney wanted it. Eventually, they finally did make an edgier film after many revisions. This one started off kind of normal, albeit darker, with certain gags being more explicit or profane, an example being characters cursing or Buzz being thrown out of the window and getting broken. Eventually, the movie continues to jump cut to random different test animations and animation cells until it gets to a 2D Disney-style animation of Woody. He has no clothes on and looks into the camera, smiling. As his skin begins to decay, he smiles. The scene continues to get more graphic as Woody says, "Don't you want it? Don't you want it? Don't you love it?" He eventually writes the word edge on the screen with one of his rotting fingertips. This, along with one of the major people working on the project passing on due to a heart attack from stress, caused Disney to stop involving themselves with the production of the film and to let Pixar do everything themselves. The Loud House. Enough is enough. On a website with a lot of lost media, the narrator finds a mysterious Loud House episode. Allegedly the real final episode of season 3, this episode was scrapped for being too disturbing. The episode opens up with Lincoln complaining about having 10 sisters before Luann walks up and begins to make some jokes as usual. Lincoln gets continually angrier and angrier until he lashes out, leaving her unconscious. He freaks out before realizing this is what he wanted to do. He goes upstairs and begins to go for his other sisters one by one. By the end, they're all shoved under his bed in his room, and he claims there's only one thing left to do. He grabs a rope and himself. After this, Luann, the only survivor, gets up. She exclaims that this isn't a joke at all and proceeds to end her own life. The narrator is left confused as to why the creator of the show would make something like this, and after further research, he could never find a real reason why. Little Witch and Jack-O-Lantern. Very similar to Candle Cove in 1999, Little Witch and Jack-O-Lantern was a local public access children's show that the narrator claims aired in the mid-1980s. The show involved Jack, the greatest wizard who of course had a jack-o'-lantern for a head, and Melanie, a young witch around the age of 8 to 9. Jack would teach Melanie different types of spells, and these spells would relate to an educational segment on the show. For example, when Melanie was supposed to make a feast with her spell, there was a segment about how farmers raise animals for people to eat. There were also other characters that the narrator can't remember as well, like a talking skull and a bookshelf. Eventually, when the narrator was 5, a commercial aired for the show that told viewers they could call a number and talk to Jack and Melanie. The narrator, excited, convinces his parents to call them, and soon he's calling the number every night. At first, the call is normal, just a pre-recorded segment of Jack and Melanie talking about their day and eventually bidding the caller goodnight. However, as the calls continue, they begin to get more and more graphic and disturbing, with Melanie at one point disappearing and possibly being badly. Eventually, the narrator gets too freaked out when Jack tells him in one call that he wanted him to help him make stew like the sleeping man that had done it prior, even calling him by his real name and responding to something he said, thus proving that it was no longer pre-recorded. This caused his parents to call the police, and he never called the number or watched the show again. Eventually, as an adult, he did more digging, not finding too much on the internet, but finding an old newspaper article from 1989 claiming that Timothy Clay, the creator of the show, was a serial, and that there were tons of under his warehouse. Eventually, when his wife and kids are out of the house, the narrator decides to call the same number 33 years later. He's horrified to receive the same greeting that Jack always gave him from a woman, who calls him by his name and asks if he wants to know what happened to Jack. At this point, he freaks out and says that he'll never call it back. The Night Garden. Some shows have odd intros, and some may be so weird that you question what exactly the origins of it could be. Well, the narrator of this story claims to know the origins of the intro of the British kids show In the Night Garden. In the beginning of each episode, a child is shown on a boat with a red blanket floating under the night stars. The narrator claims that this child is based on a real kid who, due to having neglecting parents, really only had a good time at daycare. He had a best friend named Daisy, and there were also other characters like the triplets and a boy that loved to pick up and clean rocks. The toys also represented things from the show like a train set and a radio-controlled zeppelin, inflatables, a doll's house, and bouncy balls. There were also many colored birds in an aviary in the nursery garden, as well as an old man that gave names to the dolls and told stories to the kids. Eventually, the child is abandoned by his father at the beach and is put into a boat with only a flashlight in his blanket. One of the last things he looks at is the stars in the sky. I witnessed a strange TV broadcast that no one else was awake to see. Have you ever accidentally stumbled upon the shorts unedited footage of a bear or this house has people in it while watching Adult Swim before? I'm guessing if you have, you felt pretty unnerved, possibly feeling like you just witnessed a creepypasta in real time. On an unnamed date, the narrator was watching reruns of Samurai Jack late at night when a bumper appeared. It was extremely crudely made and took place using only one camera angle with 5 people that didn't have any distinct features. The entire broadcast was a 10-minute shot, and in the beginning they watched the camera like it was a TV. This lasted around 7 minutes before people started getting up and leaving the couch. Eventually, by the 8th minute, everyone was gone and a silhouette of a man fades into the corner of the screen not long after. He was completely made of static and faced the camera while standing behind the couch. Eventually, 2 people ran back in and one was wielding an axe. There were 2 women, and the much younger one was extremely afraid of the older one who was very angry at her. A boy ran in after the older one yelled at the younger one for a bit and ran to restrain the older woman. Before he could, the axe was brought down on the young woman. It seemed really realistic to the narrator and the other characters ended up restraining the woman with the axe. It then eventually cut out after some chaos. Oddly enough, the next day the narrator noticed nobody was talking about it. However, they found out that someone had personally broadcasted the film across town using a laptop they attached to some wires. They realized from an article in the news that this may have been a reel they saw on video. His friend actually saw the video too and claimed that he saved it. After attempting to watch the tape, only the bumper came up before it cut off. No matter what the narrator tried, the result was the same. There was no footage after the bumper came on. No video. He realized clearly his friend had given him the wrong tape, but was unable to contact him. Eventually, he was contacted by his friend days later. His friend more or less told him that he's been facing real-life consequences for what he knows, and he doesn't want him to dig deeper. He hasn't been able to contact him since. Where bad kids go. Most people are punished in conventional ways when they do something wrong as a kid. Of course, this isn't always the case. In Lebanon, during a vicious war, there was a show that aired on TV. It showed a lot of sinister imagery and would talk about things that bad kids do. Bad kids stay up late, for example. At the end of every episode, there would be an old rusted door, and behind it you could make out screams of agony. Text on the screen would read out, "That's where the bad kids go," during this segment. After around 15 to 16 years, the narrator had become a journalistic photographer and decided to investigate this odd show. After finding the original filming location, he noticed how everything seemed to be burned and destroyed. Eventually, he found the infamous room, and it wasn't the remains of bone and other things that scared him the most. No, it was the fact that there was a small cage hanging down with a microphone in it. Jigsaw BBC revealed. I'm sure some of you know about the BBC kids show Jigsaw, and even more of you know about Mr. Nosybonk. This character has been seen on numerous disturbing kids characters lists and is commonly regarded as one of the most horrifying children's show characters out there. A man named Alfred White, whose whereabouts are disclosed, sent the narrator a letter in 2005 disclosing more about the odd character. He had personally worked on the show from 1979 to 1984 when it ended. Not long after the show finished, the set designer Clark Andrew allegedly invited him into a room and told him that he had to get out one last episode. He played a VHS tape that was relatively odd but nothing disturbing. After it abruptly cut out and was ejected, Alfred couldn't help but sneak back in later and play the tape again. When he did, he realized that the tape didn't end where it had the last time. It continued to play and this time showed Nosybonk in a dimly lit room sitting at a table. He doesn't do much but lay his head down until it cuts to a scene of him hopping backwards in a sack, which merged with another scene that was hard to make out. Murmuring and faint screams were heard before a cast member's face flashed on the screen and the film ended. Alfred tossed it into the trash can and left. Apparently, the episode only aired on obscure local channels and so went relatively unnoticed. It was also uploaded in places like YouTube but was swiftly taken down. Some believe there's an entire alternate version of the series, with Clark having a series of tapes with odd labels in his office. An obscure episode was also uploaded to a media site under an MP4 file. Fear of Victory. Scarecrow is a pretty infamous Batman character on his own. He's infamous for using his fear toxins on Batman and others in order to cause them to experience frightening hallucinations. The narrator of this story favored Scarecrow, however. In fact, he liked him so much that when his friend offered him a mysterious DVD with a lost episode about the villain, he eagerly took it without a second thought. The episode began with Batman and Robin chasing a very sickly and pale Scarecrow. After Scarecrow ran into an alley, Batman and Robin revealed how frantic they were to find him. Back in the alley, Scarecrow screamed and began to cough up. He was transforming, and when Batman and Robin found him, they realized that he was just a child. However, he was still the same man, just in a child's body. At first, things seemed better. However, eventually people got tired of taking care of him, and he became miserable. Batman went to speak to him, and after a brief conversation, he left, no encouragement or anything. Scarecrow found a note that stated, "Yourself," and he decided to do just that. The narrator concludes that upon seeing the final image of Scarecrow's body, he began to scream, and he doesn't know if he'll ever stop. The Dawn is Your Enemy. Adult Swim has a lot of bumpers, some of which are a bit creepier than others. The Dawn is Your Enemy is one of those creepy and downright infamous bumpers. Although we've only seen a 9-second version, allegedly the real version is around 2 minutes. During this 2-minute runtime, a lot of sounds are playing that insinuate a mass is going on. Allegedly, people across the country were calling, desperately telling Cartoon Network to turn it off. Apparently, nobody knows why it's not talked about more, but theories have ranged from cease and desist to mass hypnosis. It is alleged that on a .onion website only accessible using Tor, there is a recording of the episode out. From the few that do remember, they just want to know how Cartoon Network got that audio in the first place. Broadcast interruption. Have you ever heard of the Max Headroom incident? It was an extremely famous broadcast interruption whose perpetrator still remains unsolved. Broadcast interruptions like that one have happened all over the world, especially on small local stations. The narrator of this story claims that in Seneca, South Carolina, a local channel was hijacked with a very odd animation. The animation began with a normal family sitting at a table chatting about nothing before an odd green light filled the room and they began to look sickly. A message on a radio broadcast claimed that it was November 2017 and for everyone to report to the nearest shelter immediately. The family continues to live their life as they degrade, eventually going out for a drive. You can see the dystopian landscape as they drive past until they stop at a park and drop the kids off. The kids don't really do much there and the disturbing imagery continues. The rocks were human and even the tree had a human face and was clearly in agony. The father goes to his office job where pretty much everyone else is sitting upright at their desk. The family continues to degrade, their skin beginning to... They get home and sit back down to eat. They begin to literally merge with the chairs they're in, soon only their eyes remaining as a representation of who they once were. The eyes stare at the screen until the screen goes black. A message appears stating, "Report to the nearest shelter immediately. Remaining at private residences is strictly prohibited." Although the local paper reported it, nobody really knows what the broadcast meant or why it was released. Faith Buddies. There isn't a lot to watch on TV once it gets late enough, but sometimes you can find the odd show or two. Faith Buddies is one of those shows. It's a religious program about Christianity, and it revolves around a puppet called Pinky. Pinky is similar to Kermit the Frog, although he has no frill, is pink, and has much smaller pupils. The episode always revolves around a specific topic, and is very blunt and sometimes even graphic, all within the confines of the Bible, of course. There were also other puppets as well, like Birdie the Hippo and Gerda the Bird. Pinky was very tell it like it is and would never hold anything back or censor himself. This was relatively fine until an episode about homosexuality where he said some extremely unsavory words about a little girl's gay brother. Eventually the final episode aired. In this episode they talked about predestination. This is the concept of already being destined to go to heaven or hell regardless of what you do. A child tells Pinky that he thought Jesus died to save everyone, and Pinky says that he really only did it to save the chosen ones. He continues by saying you can't know where you go until you die, but if you look deep in your heart you may have an idea. Then he stares at the screen for a bit until another scene begins, showing different images of the punishments people could endure in the afterlife. Pinky is enjoying this and says that he's glad to see the sinners get what they deserve. The scene cuts abruptly and the credits start rolling, with the camera zooming out on the now empty set. A man with a black hood walks in and begins to douse everything in gasoline before lighting it on fire. The cameraman and the hooded man share a laugh as they toss all of the puppets into a furnace. Much like the last story, the narrator doesn't really know the purpose of this show. Perhaps it's a parody of religion, perhaps the people are just insane. We really may never know. Cops Live. You may have seen the show Cops, or perhaps the more modern counterpart Live PD. These shows can have some extreme moments such as car chases and even the rare shootout. But what about the paranormal? In this alleged episode of Cops, we visit two officers, Officer Williams of Batesville, Arkansas, and Deputy Parkhill of Louisiana. It begins by showing Officer Williams who believes he's dealing with a routine user of some type of narcotic. The man is acting erratic and sweating heavily, freaking out and pleading for help. The officer continually asks, eventually begging him to put his hands behind his back. Eventually he ends up tasing him and the man collapses to the ground. Not long after that, however, his skin turns color and tufts of fur begin to sprout out of him. Eventually the camera cuts out and they switch to Deputy Parkhill after apologizing. Parkhill was on night patrol, just observing and being ready for any possible calls that could come in. He happens upon a tall, thin man standing in the middle of the street wearing all black and a top hat. The man runs away after being confronted and the deputy catches him again. The man leaps over a house and disappears again. The deputy begins to go looking for him again when suddenly the car is crushed, the man having landed directly onto it. The officer takes out his service weapon and opens fire upon the creature twice. The creature laughs and drags the deputy into darkness before the show cuts off. What's even more odd is that contacting the towns where these incidents occurred in is nearly impossible now. It's also said that the police have been experiencing many more unexplained phenomena since the airing of that Cobbs episode. Something is taking everything over and nobody knows what it truly is yet. Return to sender. What if that creepily edited video on YouTube was more than what it seemed? That's pretty much the basis of this next story. The narrator, who enjoys a show called Postman Pat, was searching around on YouTube for Postman Pat episodes as they were on a nostalgia trip. They eventually found a video called Postman Pat, Return to Sender, and decided to watch it, thinking that it would be a creepy lost episode edit. The video wasn't black and white, and the intro was relatively the same save for some reversed audio. In the first scene, Pat simply stared lifelessly at a parcel while Jess the cat sat in a basket nearby. Considering that the video had an abnormally long timestamp of 12 hours and that he hadn't done anything but stare for the past few minutes, the author got fed up and decided to switch to another video. However, something was off. In the middle of the video, he was watching the screen flash and the return to sender video came back. He tried closing out the window and it came back again. After this, he just decided to watch it. The package he was staring at, of course, had a label stating Return to Sender on it. The parcel remained the main focus of the camera as the sound of weeping grew louder and louder in the background. The sound of a cat hissing, then crying in pain played as the package dropped in slow motion. Images of cats began to flash on the screen for a bit before it flashed back to Pat, who was holding the package again. He opened the package and broke down, a lifeless paw flopping out of it as he set it down. He wept for a bit until the screen went black and the narrator's laptop shut off. The narrator advises people not to click on the video if they see it because you know what they say. Curiosity killed the cat. A different television channel. This story is so short that I'm just going to read it to you word for word. In some television markets, people get two different versions of the same channel. This is usually caused by affiliates living nearby. For example, while living in New Jersey receiving the ABC affiliate from both New York City and Philadelphia, or living in Southern California and getting both the Los Angeles and San Diego stations. For the most part, these appear to be the same channel in all except local news and some daytime programming, with the exception that one is actually closer and more clear than the other. These channels, in reality, should not occur. Television markets are set up to focus around one city, and offering two different versions of the same channel in one market can split viewership in the ever-competitive ratings race. If you were to watch the channel with worse reception from the city that is further away, you'll start to notice that the news reports major events that never occurred, on people that aren't real, and on technology that shouldn't exist. The ads are for products that you've never heard of. The conspiracy theorists think that these television stations belong to an alternate world. They point to the fact that the news tends to be getting worse over there, more separate from our own. There are reports of looking into an alternate world and invading it for their own. Just pray they aren't talking about us. Colwin's Corner. As a kid, a lot of things are viewed differently through our eyes compared to when we get older. Colwin's Corner is a kid show that the narrator watched as a child. As the narrator enjoyed watching kid shows with his little sister, when he found an episode of Colwin's Corner on DVD in the bottom of a box in his attic, he decided to put it on for her. The episode opened a bit off, the visuals being darker and the music being a bit slowed. The show began normally with Colwin saying hi to the viewers. He opened the door to two tall white puppets with no features but two large black eyes. The narrator was uneasy and wanted to turn it off, but his little sister wanted him to keep it on. Colwin asked them what they wanted to do today, and one of the puppets replied with a loud screaming sound. At this point, the narrator takes the DVD out and puts it away. Eventually, they decided to watch it by themselves when everyone was asleep. After the puppet replied with a screech, Colwin responded with, "You're right, we should play a game," and pulled a knife out. At this point, a live-action arm painted orange was shown, and Colwin began to his arm, screaming loudly as he did it. Soon, he did the same to a live-action neck that was painted orange. After this, the puppet's eyes were white and he gasped for air before falling to the ground. At this point, the narrator throws the DVD away. The next morning, he sees his sister finishing the episode and asks her where she got it before telling her that the show was really bad. She responds, "No, it's not. They were just baking a cake." The narrator, confused, asks what Colwin's friends looked like. His sister replies, "One was blue and one was red. Can I watch it again?" Willy Wonka beta tape. Similar to a couple of other stories in this video, do you ever wonder what the original version of a book or movie may have been like? Perhaps it was just slightly different. Perhaps it was much darker. In the case of the beloved book Willy Wonka, it was the latter. The narrator of this story wanted to know the origins of the Willy Wonka book and contacted an unnamed man who was formerly acquainted with Roald Dahl, the creator of Willy Wonka. The man sent him back a tape that allegedly had the original version of the book on it. The narrator was confused as VHS tapes weren't around in 1963, but decided that it's possible they transferred film to VHS and began to watch it. After some odd issues with audio and visuals, the camera eventually zooms in on the outside of the bucket's home. The art style is odd. Everything is black and white and has a misty/cloudy look. Pretty much every character's personality is different. A narrator spoke in the background, but the audio was too low quality and quiet to be able to make anything out. Charlie is much more effeminate, Grandpa Joe is much angrier, and the parents are pretty mentally ill. Wonka is also apparently a Grinch, and nobody has a clue how he owns the factory he does. When Charlie gets the ticket, it's completely blank, and it's not even stated whether it's gold or not. The other kids' interviews don't play when they find the tickets either. Eventually they go on the factory tour, and immediately there are a lot of things off. One of the largest has to be the fact that there was a sixth child whose name is unknown at this point. Wonka is also very inhuman, his eyes appearing especially reptilian in nature. His voice was also very high. After they entered the factory, the insides were like something out of a Tim Burton film. The hallways twisted and turned around and got more and more convoluted as they continued to enter them. This was cut off for a bit by a black screen with odd text that was a mixture of Greek and Korean. Eventually they finally get to the chocolate room. This version of the chocolate room is pretty much identical to the 2005 Tim Burton film. The river is especially unsettling because it looks like real, in the sense that it's clearly been painted with that instead of red paint. This part also introduces the Oompa Loompas. These are people that Willy Wonka forcefully took from their homes in Africa and more or less forces to work. Here Wonka was revealed to be an extremely immoral person, saying extremely unsavory things about the Oompa Loompas that the narrator dared not to repeat. Eventually they sailed through the tunnel, and this portion was extremely similar to the film with Gene Wilder, however it was much darker and more explicit. The narrator comes in and speaks about all of the horrible things that Wonka did to the Oompa Loompas. We also find out that the sixth child is named Miranda. As they continue to go from room to room, kids just disappear. There's no funny moment or lesson, they're just not there anymore. Eventually Charlie is told that he's getting the factory, and Wonka walks off to another room. This room contains every kid except for Miranda. Wonka turns on the radio, which plays an odd song that talks about events that would happen to specific people in 2014. Right before the movie cut off, Wonka took off his shirt and it slowly dropped to the ground. The narrator, confused and horrified, decided to ask the man who sent him the tape about why it was that way. This man responded that this was of course the way Dahl wanted the story to be, and that he always drew stories out prior to writing the book. The narrator concludes by saying they haven't been able to find any more info on the tape. Parents. So after some looking, I have zero clue what Parents is. However, I'm not going to leave this blank, so we'll cover Parents Day instead. Parents Day is a holiday that Max and Ruby are attempting to celebrate in an alleged lost episode. After making a cake, Ruby leaves Max in the house while she helps Grandma inside. Eventually, after making more food, they wait on the parents to come home to celebrate. The grandma gets a call and becomes more somber, clearly having received some bad news. They soon go to the hospital and they're told that the parents collided with an 18-wheeler on the highway. It then shows the crash, nothing graphic, just the vehicles colliding and the wreckage afterwards. They're still alive as well, hooked up to a bunch of different machines and such. Max and Ruby can barely handle it. Max ends up having an intense panic attack and is placed into the same hospital while Ruby can only cry. Eventually, the parents pass away. Funny Mouse. The closest I have to this one is Funny Mouse bootleg tape. As with the last one, if anyone has any idea what these stories actually are, please let everyone know in the comments below. That being said, let's explain this one. Urban explorers were looking around an old abandoned house in Wyoming when they noticed a video cassette in an old withered box. It was labeled as Mouse Funny. The episode started off completely blurred out for a bit before it focused. It simply said the word mouse. This then faded out and faded into a looping frame of Mickey standing staring at the camera. His white eyes were oddly very detailed. The camera began to slowly zoom into his face and he began to smile. As he did so, his eyes began to widen and the sound of a bell ringing began to loop in the background. His eyes began to bulge and his mouth began to curl up to his ears and then began to open before everything stopped. It just stayed on his face in silence for a few seconds. Then the image began to blur, as sounds of faint screaming could be heard in the background. It zoomed more and a sound of metal scraping metal plate as Mickey began to twitch rapidly, the smile remaining on his face. The screaming turned into the screaming of one specific man before Mickey ran out of view. That's where the episode ended. A year later, one of the men who found the episode was outside of the abandoned home, and two others refused to speak about the tape. One other explorer attempted to get verification of where the tape came from and was only told that it clearly couldn't have been a real tape made by Disney. The final adventure of Tintin. In this lost episode of The Front Show The Adventures of Tintin, we begin with Tintin and Haddock underground doing some spelunking. Suddenly, a loud explosion erupts outside, and after leaving the underground, we're met with quite the graphic image. Every single character, including some of the villains, are just laying there. After checking their pulses, Tintin confirms they're all dead. He tells Haddock that he guesses they're doomed too, and Haddock sheds a tear before the episode ends. The narrator wonders why the creator would have made an episode like this, and goes to sleep with the episode still replaying in their mind. America's Funniest Home Videos, banned episode. In Mexico, the narrator's friend decided to record an odd episode of America's Funniest Home Videos they found on a random channel. The episode opened up with the host Tom wearing a Christmas hat and sitting there and no audience. He covers multiple clips like usual, but unlike the typical episode, the clips are graphic and get worse with each video. The first is a man decorating a tree on a balcony while standing on a chair, and a Santa pops out and scares him. This causes him to fall off and hurt his arm. The second is a young boy who opens a present that ends up being a bear trap and he gets his wrist caught in it. The third is a woman crushing glass ornaments and eating them. The fourth is a group of kids singing Christmas carols in front of the fire. A man who's putting up stockings misfires a nail gun and hits a kid multiple times. The fifth has a crowd in front of a live nativity scene that turns into a The sixth and last has a family working on a metal Christmas tree sculpture when the last rod slips and goes into a man's face. After this, the episode just ends with Tom saying goodnight, no voting on the best clip or anything. The narrator thinks it could be a parody with a look-alike, but the friend claims it's real and that on this mysterious channel they have other weird episodes of American shows. The narrator tells them they can keep the evidence of those to themselves. Episode 11. The narrator of this story has a regular tradition with his wife for their anniversary. He always buys her a cartoon and she always buys him a tie. Since he did so well with his gift to her last year, he desperately wants to outdo himself yet again. Due to being a substitute teacher, he happens to come in contact with a man named Milo, another teacher at the school. Milo told him about a weird cartoon from Eastern Europe he had in his attic, being an older Eastern European person himself. The narrator excitedly asked for it and Milo delivered. The narrator takes it home and watches it. The first 10 episodes are all drawn in an extremely detailed old Disney style of animation. Each episode also leads with the title card, save episodes 9 and 10. The first title card says, "This is the first episode," or something to that effect. Episode 1 introduces the character, a guy that's a college student. Not much is said, and most of the episode contains him walking. Eventually he enters a building and comes upon 4 girls. They stare at him, seeming to hold in laughter, and he stares back blankly. Eventually one throws a hot drink in his face, causing him to hold his face while it begins to blister up. He slips back and falls, and they laugh at him harder and harder before he pushes past them and leaves. The episode ends on his blistered, pained face. A loud shriek plays afterward, which will recur throughout the other episodes. When the next title card came up, it read, "And this is the second one." The second episode contained the main character sewing a doll, the end result being a doll with eyes X'd out and a sinister grin. The main character looks down at it and smiles for the first time, though only slightly. The next title card is a message. It roughly read, "Yasin, hello, this is my animation for Academy. I worked on it for a long time and I have something for you. I hope you enjoy, and I will do it soon." In the third episode, the main character makes the same walk to the building, but the girls aren't there anymore. He enters an auditorium with a professor who begins to lecture. He gets more and more passionate, more frantic as beads of sweat run down his face. He eventually begins to grasp at his throat, the animation playing in excruciating detail. He falls down and seems to have passed away. At this point, everyone just nonchalantly gets up and leaves, no facial expressions, no emotion. The episode ends just showing the professor laying there. The next title card roughly read, "It should be clear what this means." The episode just contains the protagonist writing and scratching at the back of his neck until he creates an open wound. The title screen after this read, "I wish it could have been this easy." The fifth episode contained the protagonist taking the paper he'd written on and putting it in an envelope before sliding it under a door labeled 056. It's then revealed that the wound on his neck healed. The title card then reads, "It was all so..." Episode 6 just has the protagonist talking to his friend from one angle until the friend leaves. The text following this said, "I tried not to... what I felt." The protagonist receives a letter in episode 7 and excitedly reads it. It clearly doesn't say anything good because he balls his fist up and throws it into the wall before he leaves and is heard shouting and crying off screen for the rest of the episode. The text following this says, "That isn't important." Episode 8 has someone squirming in a bed in the protagonist's room, always under the covers due to barbed wire holding them in. They struggle until they go limp and the episode ends. The rest of the episodes have no title card. The protagonist cleans up his room in episode 9 and right before walking out of the door turns around and starts talking. This is drowned out by a screeching noise, so what he's saying is inaudible. The episode ends. Episode 10 has the protagonist walking to the same building as the camera slowly zooms out. Eventually the protagonist is only the size of an ant and then the tape corrupts. After a while of it being corrupted, another title card appears. This one says, "This will be my favorite episode." It contains 4 chairs and soon 4 unconscious girls in said chairs, possibly the ones who attacked the protagonist in episode 1. The protagonist, all of them, before taking his cell phone out of his pocket and taking pictures of them. Obviously this doesn't make sense as the tape is supposed to have been before cell phones, which came off as odd to the narrator. It then showed realistic pictures of the women in live action. At this point the protagonist rushes to call Milo, thinking it was his fault. His wife comes home and notices his distress but leaves to go upstairs as he claims he just needs to make a call. He calls Milo and Milo claims to have no idea what the situation is. Suddenly the narrator's wife screams and he finds out that someone scrawled XII, the Roman numeral for 11, into his glass bedroom window. Milo calls the police as he heard the scream and the narrator dropping his phone, and they soon arrive. Sadly, the tape caught on fire and destroyed the tape recorder, so it couldn't be retrieved. Although Milo was accused, there was no verifiable evidence and everything was more or less dropped. There was a message that was still left on the screen after the tape ended somehow. It said, "Episode 12 coming soon. Akuryō Bubbles." Much like the last story, you have to be careful when buying a present for someone else. The narrator in this story is looking for a present for his daughter online and happens upon a DVD from the Powerpuff Girls franchise that he's never seen before. It had Japanese on it and contained Bubbles looking up over the bottom of the case. The Japanese stated "evil spirit." When asking the seller about it, they simply tell him that there's nothing like it. He ends up buying it and before receiving it decides to watch it before giving it to his daughter. He starts with part 2 in the aftermath of whatever event occurred in part 1. Utonium is seen here sitting distraught, clearly thinking about Bubbles as an image of her quickly flashes over the screen. The animation is very good, nearly realistic as he sat there breathing. After Utonium goes upstairs to check on the girls, he's tormented by a shadowy figure clearly resembling Bubbles. When it reveals itself, it's a gray monster that screeches, first high and then impossibly low. The creature flickers out of vision and Utonium looks around before the creature's screaming face flashes on screen, scaring the narrator. He finally checks on the girls and they're sleeping soundly outside of Bubbles, who wasn't there of course. After the episode ends, the narrator decides to watch part 1. This part reveals that Bubbles was transformed due to a concoction Utonium made that contained chemical X. Right after this, she goes to her school and it plays a scene where her teacher is frightened by Bubbles' new form. This is cut into by a real-life scene of a man recording. The man gives a young girl a DVD that's identical to the one that the narrator received. The scene then cuts and shows a group of Japanese school children horrified and cowering in the corner of a room from a small figure wearing a robe. Soon the figure attacked and the cameraman ran along with the children. The narrator realized that the cameraman was the same guy who sold him the DVD. Eventually it shows Blossom and Buttercup looking at Bubbles, Utonium crying as he sees it. The episode fades out and into an angry Bubbles with red eyes walking towards the screen, and then the episode cuts off. The narrator sits in silence for a bit before walking up to his own room. In the hallway he hears a light whisper like a hiss. This scares him and he quickly heads into his own room and shuts the door. After a knock at the door, he opens it to see a Powerpuff Girl. Her eyes were red and she croaked a hello. Then the narrator woke up and realized that it was all a dream and that he'd gotten a plush instead. WWF, canceled In Your House pay-per-view. For those of you that watch pro wrestling, you may remember In Your House, a pay-per-view series that the WWF held. The narrator of this story found a box set of every single episode of the In Your House series and quickly went home to watch it. When scrolling through the episodes, he noticed that there was a 29th episode called Armageddon in Your House. The narrator found this odd as for one, there were only supposed to be 28 episodes, and that the first Armageddon was in December of 1999 while the box set apparently released in summer of 1999. Despite this, he decided to check the episode out. The first match he looked at was normal, but the second one was definitely not. This match was an Inferno match containing Kane and Mankind. The match is normal all the way until Kane tosses Mankind into the flames. At first it seems like nothing happened until ear-piercing screaming explodes from the flames. Of course, this eventually shows the graphic results of Mankind being on fire. The narrator was perplexed and only one other person remembered the match. They claimed that the Mankind that was burned was the original Mankind, different from the current one that just happens to look very similar. They then contacted the guy that sold them the box set and he said that he got it from the black market and thought it'd be good for collectors. The narrator says that they've never touched that DVD again. Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. You may know about Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, the 1995 Godzilla film. Similar to some of the other stories in this Iceberg, there is an original version of this movie that is a bit different from the final product. The narrator of this story is a Godzilla fan and decided to directly order a VHS of the movie early directly from a Japanese source prior to the time the movie actually came out. This movie was similar to the final cut but had some stark differences. It opens up with Godzilla on Birth Island, the place where he went with his son after he defeated Space Godzilla. After spending some time on the island, the screen goes white and opens with the usual Hong Kong Rampage introduction the movie actually has. Pretty much everything is the same from here with a couple errors, like Godzilla Jr. missing roars and the juvenile Destoroyah puppet strings being visible. When Destoroyah slams Godzilla Jr., however, the camera shows him hitting the ground instead of showing Miki and her friend's shocked faces. It then shows Jr.'s face foaming from the mouth before he falls limp. Godzilla charges Destoroyah, attempting to avenge his son, but Destoroyah simply tosses him to the side with ease. He struggles to get up and makes his way over to his son. Godzilla angrily mourns his son, attempting to revive him with radiation like in the movie. However, unlike the movie, Jr. didn't even wake up briefly before passing on. He just didn't move. Another interesting scene is one in which Destoroyah charges his chest beam and it actually shows the beam leaving his chest and hitting Godzilla. After this, the scene fades into white and a new scene appears. This time it went back to Jr., who was now on fire. The suit revealed flesh-colored cloth underneath as it burned. It then cuts to the JSDF attempting to defeat Destoroyah. After some fighting, they end up being blown up due to Destoroyah using a beam on them. This was the end of the tape. The narrator notes how it's interesting that there was no, as sometimes this is used in Godzilla movies to signify serious injury. They also talk about how they're happy to keep the movie and wonder what other secrets it may hold. Retired. Working at the Krusty Krab can be tough. I know that we've always noticed how easy it is for Mr. Krabs, SpongeBob, and Squidward to get overwhelmed as the customers rush in. We see the result of this in an odd SpongeBob episode called Retired. The narrator desperately wanted to watch SpongeBob as a comfort show because it reminded him of his great childhood. However, due to the fact that it wasn't on Nick when he turned it on, he felt like he would have to wait until another time. However, he just happened to notice out of the window that a yard sale was being held next door. Luckily, they were selling a SpongeBob DVD which he quickly brought inside and played. He noticed an episode titled Retired. It started relatively normally with SpongeBob waking up and chanting his phrase "I'm ready" as he headed to work. He went through the day relatively smoothly, his typical happy-go-lucky attitude holding strong. Eventually the customers disappeared for some reason and SpongeBob leaves the kitchen out of confusion. Instantly, Mr. Krabs chews him out and Squidward joins him. This causes SpongeBob to feel hurt and he sadly leaves the restaurant. He walks down the road and in the city, passerbys are actually really nice to him, which cheers him up a bit. However, they would start to slowly fade away to SpongeBob's distress and confusion. After they're all gone, SpongeBob collapses to the ground and begins to cry. A church bell rang in the background as he continued to sob on the ground for a few minutes. Eventually he ventures to Patrick's house and realizes nobody is opening up. He squeezes under the rock and finds Patrick. He cries over this before finding Squidward, who doesn't care about what's happening to him. SpongeBob goes home to find Gary, who also wasn't there. After a 2-hour time skip, he's shown laying on the bed and asks if the day could get any worse. Eventually he gets up, the camera zoomed in on his somber face before he leaves the house heading to the Krusty Krab. The Krusty Krab was clearly dilapidated, looking moldy and off color. SpongeBob enters and ends up in the corner of the dim room. He sits down for a long time, crying before looking out of the window. The camera pans outside of the Krusty Krab, showing a shadowy humanoid figure. The figure twitched violently before letting out a loud screech and filling the screen with red static. Eventually it went away and SpongeBob was in a much more disgusting version of the same room, his shoes now missing. Beside him was of sandy cheeks, and the humanoid creature stood behind him. A red claw slowly reached into the screen, and when it was fully in view, the camera zoomed in on SpongeBob's face. He seemed to be gasping for air, possibly being forced above the surface by Mr. Krabs. The shot turned black and white and showed the island above Bikini Bottom and SpongeBob's house before showing SpongeBob still suffering. Eventually, he finally stopped struggling and gasping, his tongue laying out of his mouth and his eyes rolling to the back of his head as he fell limp. It then showed the Employee of the Month wall on the Krusty Krab and zoomed in on SpongeBob's face, whose eyes had been scribbled out. The text under the picture read "Retired." It faded to a black screen with white text that said, "SpongeBob, you're fired." It cut again to Mr. Krabs smiling in a room beside SpongeBob's. The narrator then claims that he has to keep the DVD at all costs to keep anyone else from having it, and that he can't give you any screenshots due to not having a camera. Ruby's afternoon snack.avi. Animating is one of the hardest skills to become good at, and a lot of people prefer actually being taught by a professional instead of just doing it themselves. The narrator of this story decided to take the same route by enrolling in a school that had an animation class. On the first day, the professor tells the class that they need to create an animation that's original or based off of a show. The narrator, completely unable to understand what to do, just sat there while everyone else got to work. Eventually, a kid named Nathan talked to them and told them they'd help them out. Nathan was making a Max and Ruby animation along with 2 other kids who served as voice actors. Nathan talks to the narrator and the narrator introduces himself as Stan. After class, Stan decides to see what Nathan made and notices that it's called Ruby's afternoon snack. He decides that he needs to see what Nathan made, but wants to do it with the permission of the professor. The professor asks Stan to ask Nathan, who says it's fine. The professor and Stan begin the episode. The episode opens up normally until Max and Ruby are on the title screen waving. During this portion, Ruby looks over at Max and begins to lick her lips and grin. The episode begins normally, Ruby playing with her dolls and Max playing somewhere else. Max begins to mess with Ruby, who quickly finds out and tries to find him. Max messes with her again and hides in the bathroom before Ruby gives up on finding him. She makes sandwiches for them both to get him to come downstairs, and he does. Eventually, she lectures Max and tells him that he can't mess with her stuff anymore and that he needs to play by himself. He eventually goes to play with his toys while Ruby remains at the table. After Max is shown playing with his toys for a bit, the camera pans over to Ruby, who locks eyes with Max and grins at him while licking her lips again. She goes upstairs and begins to play with her toys when she notices that Max had put worms and dirt into her teapot. She breaks down with anger, saying she'll get him for this. Eventually, Max gets bored and after messing around with a bunch of stuff in the house, goes upstairs to see Ruby. Ruby has her back turned to him, but after he tugs on her dress to get her attention, she turns around slowly with the same grin from earlier. Her ears are laid down now and she asks Max what's wrong and if he wants a hug from his sister. Max runs away and slams the door on her before beginning to look for a way out. Ruby ends up running into the door as Max runs downstairs and tries every doorknob. Nothing works and Ruby is quickly coming down the stairs now. Max hides under the couch and we see the world from his perspective, seeing her feet slowly walk by a couple of times. Eventually she can't find him and is about to go outside when Max sighs with relief. This causes her to find him, and due to her looking normal, Max relaxes and comes out. Of course, this quickly changes as she again grins widely and opens her mouth before swallowing him whole. She then heads back upstairs and right before the episode closes out, A is heard. The professor chews Nathan out for this before failing him and kicking him out of the class. Stan is traumatized but ends up learning how to animate from the professor and gets an A on his project. Stan explains that over time Nathan got worse and worse, turning into a bully and eventually being banned from the school. He then explains that he continued to animate and learn, and that his good memories of Max and Ruby weren't corrupted by Nathan's animation. Ren Stimpy. Dirt like you belongs to the ground. On Christmas Eve with the help of his dad, who is the only one on his side in the family, the narrator of this story sneaks around and opens the DVD that he finds with his name on it under the Christmas tree. It's one of the very few presents not addressed to his bratty cousin that he hated. This DVD is a Ren and Stimpy one, which claims to have a special bonus episode. The narrator decides to sneak it up to his room and watch it. After opening it up on his laptop, he goes to the episode selection and decides on the bonus episode. The thumbnail for this episode has a photo of Stimpy crying and screaming. After starting the episode up, we see the title card which says, "Dirt like you belongs to the ground." It shows Ren lying in a ditch with a figure resembling Stimpy standing over him. The episode begins with Ren waking up and stretching before going into the kitchen where Stimpy's cooking breakfast. Stimpy cheerily tells Ren to go make some coffee to wake himself up and puts the food down on the table. Ren quickly finishes and puts his plate and silverware in the sink for Stimpy to wash. Stimpy questions why Ren can't wash it, and Ren angrily tells him that they switch chores every day before beginning to yell at him, questioning if he remembers what he said 2 years ago. Stimpy tries to reason with Ren, only escalating the situation until Ren leaves to go watch TV. Stimpy forlornly washes the dishes and slowly puts them into the dishwasher before walking upstairs to go get his purse. Ren immediately confronts him and begins screaming at him about getting his purse and going out before lunch is done. Stimpy agrees in fear, and after Ren leaves, he lays down on the bed and begins to cry. Eventually, after some time, Ren checks on Stimpy because he wouldn't come downstairs after he angrily called him multiple times to come down and make lunch. Stimpy is sitting in a dimly lit corner of the room, his back to Ren. Ren begins to ask Stimpy if he's alright before Stimpy turns around and screams at Ren at the top of his lungs, startling the narrator. He's completely feral, with his claws protruding and his teeth sharp as his eyes bulge out of his sockets and his veins pulsate. He aggressively asks Ren if it looks like he's okay, and Ren steps back while asking Stimpy what happened to him. Stimpy yells at Ren that this is his fault, that he pushed him past his limit. Ren tries to reason with him, saying that he'll do all the work for the next couple days. Stimpy claws Ren, and it shows a detailed close-up of Ren's face coming out of the scratch. Ren gets mad and asks Stimpy why he did that, and Stimpy tells him that he had it coming. Stimpy also explains that Ren has never really been his friend because he's always treated him badly since day one for no reason. Ren states that that's because Stimpy's an idiot and that his idiocy is frustrating, but that he does genuinely want to be his friend. Ren moves in to grab Stimpy by the neck, but Stimpy knocks him out with a flower pot before he can do so. The next scene shows Ren in a hazy room tied to a wooden chair. Stimpy enters the room with a rusty knife and makes his way towards Ren. At this point, after some suspense, he attacks him with the blade. He attacks him further, accidentally freeing him with one of the movements of his knife. Ren gets up and attacks him despite his serious injuries, and Stimpy eventually knocks Ren out with the knife. Stimpy drags him outside and dangles him over the ditch he dug. He tells him right before he drops him, "Before I bury you, Ren, I have one more thing to say. Dirt like you belongs to the ground." After this, he lets him go and Ren falls in slow motion, and then shows Stimpy slowly turning around, his face back to normal. He looks into the camera for a few seconds before winking, and then it fades into the end screen. It shows Ren, his fur discolored as he lays in a coffin, his eyes now excess. He had worms squirming through him and his mouth was open, his tongue laying out. A shadow of Stimpy was above him with a grin on his face, and in Ren's left hand was a piece of paper labeled "The End." After this, the narrator decides to go to sleep and has some odd dreams. He then wakes up on Christmas to a bunch of presents due to his dad now having full custody, and he explains how his mom now has life in prison, which he's happy about. He then talks about moving and says that he does still have the DVD and does use it, but will never watch the bonus episode again. Three Stooges, Dead Dunderheads. In the 1930s and 40s, the Three Stooges were aired in movie theaters for the general public to enjoy. In 1947, Half-Wit's Holiday was set to air in theaters. On the fourth day of its release, the movie aired in a shopping center in a small town. When the movie airing began, the title frame slowly faded into view before there was scuffling heard for a few minutes, and the title, The Three Stooges, changed to Dead Dunderheads, and then Dead Dunderheads spelled right, and then Dead. The episode quickly began in a room with no furniture, a tarp on the ground, and a ladder in the background. The room was clearly being remodeled. Three characters that are clearly in distress are introduced at different times. First is a man that looks like Mo, next is a man that looks like Curly, and finally a woman that looks like Larry is also there. Although the people are clearly in intense distress, the episode is going kind of normally. Larry climbs the ladder and begins to work on the roof while Curly opens his toolbox and lays out a bunch of sharp tools on the tarp. Mo accidentally catches one of his feet on the ladder. Larry is working on it, both of them fall. The wrench in Larry's hand hits the back of Mo's head, which injures him badly. Larry painfully struggles to stand up and then waits for Mo to get up, poking him in the eyes when he does. Mo says, "If you want a war, you'll get a war." This causes a fight between Mo and Larry, which ends up with Larry collapses, and at this point everyone has left the theater except for one person, a film student. He continued to watch and take notes, not knowing it was real. Larry cries for a bit on the ground, and Mo angrily confronts the cameraman before it cuts, causing a bunch of fuzziness and flashing for a bit. Eventually it comes back and Larry is unconscious while Mo and Curly ignore her laying there. Mo is sawing wood and Curly is hammering some nails into the wall. Curly accidentally slips on a tool and while reaching out scratches himself on a saw. Mo gets mad at Curly and scolds him by him in the stomach hard. Mo and Curly continue to work until they have to saw wood. Curly holds the wood and Mo deliberately saws too close to his fingers, causing a vicious altercation that leaves both of them near gone. At this point, the audience watching them film is laughing hard and the film cuts off. The police quickly grab the tape and begin to investigate where it came from. They determine the age and voice pitch of the director from his hand appearing and him snickering at some parts. They also find out that the individuals in the video were an autistic man who was wandering the streets, a businessman who was an addict, and a woman who was cheating with many people. They theorize that the director was someone who wanted to purge the world of imperfection. The narrator reveals that the film student who was in the theater was their grandpa, and that even he was investigated, but ultimately nothing came of it and nobody was ever convicted or charged with anything. They end the story by saying that they have to go because someone told them they'd be starring in an independent film of their own. July 25th, 2005. Sometimes technology can act up, creating odd glitches and effects in shows that are airing on TV. The narrator of this story may have experienced something similar. One night, the narrator notices that SpongeBob is airing on TV and decides to watch it. The episode that was currently airing was Your Shoes Untied. It was normal until SpongeBob tripped in the Krusty Krab. When he did, Patrick said, "Hey SpongeBob," as usual, but SpongeBob didn't get up. Patrick then said SpongeBob's name in a much more concerned manner. He still didn't get up and the camera began to zoom in on him, and he looked up twice, both for a split second. It looked like he was gasping. It stayed on his body until it cut to static for a while. When it finally came back, SpongeBob was laying on the floor in the Krusty Krab. Then it cut to SpongeBob floating in a black room, and then cut again to SpongeBob and Gary sitting in the shoe at the end of the episode. It cut to static and then cut to black. Suddenly, the following episode, Gary Takes a Bath, begins to play. The episode is normal until the halfway mark, where it shows a distorted visual of SpongeBob and Gary, SpongeBob staring directly at the screen. The narrator decides to go to bed after this, giving up on the odd episode. They conclude by wondering how this happened and if it was even real. They still don't have an answer, but know one day the mystery will be solved. A Bug's Life deleted scene. One day when the narrator was walking home from swimming practice, they just happened to find a VHS on the ground labeled, "Don't watch, Pixar confidential tape." They of course played it anyway, and it began with static for a few minutes. When the picture cleared up, it was near the end of the movie when Hopper corners Flick into the bird's nest. Eventually Hopper attacks Flick, and it's much more violent than in the final cut. Suddenly a bird sees what Hopper is doing and roars at him, apparently sounding exactly like Godzilla. The bird jams its beak into Hopper and carries him off, dropping him into its nest and allowing its kids to eat him. The screen cuts to black and screams are heard. It then shows the aftermath, the Lavender Town theme playing in the background, and no, I'm not joking. Hopper had one eye X'd out and the other was hanging out of its socket. He was missing an arm and wing, and his mouth was... The narrator concludes by saying they uploaded some footage to YouTube and then sold the tape on eBay. El Chavo del Ocho lost episode. El Chavo del Ocho is a Mexican comedy series that was popular in Spain, Brazil, Latin America, and the US. It centers around the main character El Chavo, who is played by the series creator, and the other inhabitants of the apartment building or vecindad. There's an episode of this show where Chavo pretends to have been hit by a car. Apparently there was a 4-month gap between this and the previous episode, and in that 4 months the creator had filmed what originally would have been the series finale. In this episode, El Chavo leaves the apartment complex and heads out before it switches to Kiko and La Chilindrina. Kiko asks La Chilindrina where El Chavo is in his character's voice, although his cheeks aren't puffed up as much. La Chilindrina says that he's in the street with tomato sauce, and during this moment you can hear loud roaring on certain tapes. It then shows the scene from the actual episode that aired where the characters are crying over El Chavo before switching to a different scene. This shows El Chavo in a coffin, the characters mourning over him. This scene is especially long and shows that whoever the man in the coffin is, it's not the man who actually acted as El Chavo. He looked like he'd really received the injuries El Chavo had only pretended to get, and some of the characters seemed to be in genuine mourning, like Kiko wasn't even putting on the voice anymore. It's unknown who the man is, but it's said that the creator wanted to do what nobody else on television had done before. Scooby-Doo lost episode. God. I mean, we all know that Shaggy is the strongest fictional character in all of creation, but where is this power sourced from? Well, this episode attempts to offer a little insight. As the narrator cozies up to watch an episode of Scooby-Doo while the storm clouds roll in, they notice that on screen the same storm is affecting the gang. Oddly enough though, everyone is staying away from Shaggy, who has a clear look of malice in his eyes. The narrator was off-put, especially when they realized no title sequence or music had played prior to the episode beginning. Whenever anyone talks to Shaggy, they sound afraid, as opposed to Shaggy, who is completely calm and is talking in a slightly deeper voice, not saying his usual like at all. As they wander throughout the mansion, Fred and Daphne team up while Scooby and Velma do the same. Shaggy walks around by himself until he reaches a mirror where he sees a large black mask with red glowing eyes staring back at him. The mirror shatters as he staggers back, bumping into Daphne. Fred wasn't there for some reason. Shaggy moves towards her and the screen cuts to black as a scream of agony blasts through the speakers. The startled narrator continues to watch in fear as it fades back in to show the aftermath, Daphne with a look of horror on her face and... Shaggy maniacally laughs before searching for the others, and soon finding Fred and Velma. Fred confronts him and Shaggy speaks using Daphne's voice, who asks Fred for help. Perhaps he's replaying what she said in her final moments? Or maybe he's taken her soul and is allowing it to communicate through his body, who knows. Shaggy soon repeats the same thing that he did to Daphne on them, the screen also cutting to black and playing two loud screams like the previous interaction. Eventually he finds Scooby and tells him that he's going to use 5% of his power on him instead of the 1% that he used on the others. The scene turns to one showing the silhouettes of Scooby and Shaggy, Scooby turning to ash. Only ashes and shards of his dog tag remain. Shaggy then looks at the screen and tells the narrator that they seem like a worthy opponent. Lightning cracks and Shaggy disappears from the screen. The narrator freezes up as they hear laughter slowly coming up behind them. Disney Plus and chill. Honestly, I'm not even sure if this counts as a lost episode creepypasta, but let's get into it anyway. The narrator of this story talks about how he met a woman at a job he was applying to and he instantly wanted to get with her. After some interaction, they exchange numbers. Eventually he calls her and they talk about old cartoons they enjoy before she tells him about Disney Plus. He doesn't know about it and immediately decides to sign up. She says she'll come over and watch it with him, and he cleans up the house waiting on her. She shows up and they begin to watch the movie Hocus Pocus. She claims that witches are actually real, and at first he thinks she's joking, but he soon realizes that she's serious. He asks her how she knows, and she says that she actually used to be one. Eventually he asks her to prove it, and she gets up. She gets a lighter and speaks into the flame, causing it to flicker and turn a red color. The narrator says that that's pretty cool and notes that he didn't know that she was a magician, and she insists that she's a witch. The narrator is confused by this and asks her how she learned to be a witch. She says that he taught her. When asked to elaborate, she simply says him, and then tells the narrator to check his door. He cautiously walks over and listens to the door, hearing heavy breathing before he checks out of the peephole and sees a person in a long robe. The person suddenly knocks on the door, startling the narrator before he turns around and runs back, noticing that the woman was gone. He looks around for her and eventually finds her on the ceiling. She jumps onto him and he can't breathe as she muffles his screams. The person eventually breaks into the house while he's pinned down and begins to cause him to see images of evil and things he's never imagined before. Eventually everything stops and suddenly the lady is back on the couch as if nothing happened. The narrator demands to know what happened and she just calls him crazy. The Mason. This is about a lost episode of Seinfeld that the narrator has due to them being a staff member at NBC. The episode is from 1995 and opens up with Jerry walking out seeming intoxicated as he speaks about the fact that a bunch of his family and friends have been passing on recently. George frantically runs up and after 5 minutes of stuttering and babbling manages to say that there has been an attack on the Twin Towers. Jerry turns the TV on and sure enough the news coverage is right there, allegedly 6 years prior to the events. George then says that Kramer and Elaine are actually inside. Kramer calls and says that he's going to jump because the oxygen is getting too low while also informing Jerry that Elaine has passed. This then cuts to live footage of one of the jumpers. George gets fed up and leaves the set and Jerry eventually begins a Masonic ritual, while a poster of Barack Obama is also seen hanging up on the wall. Jerry then wakes up as if it was a nightmare. Kramer asks Jerry if he's seen a lizard and Jerry replies that they're all lizards, showing that his pupils have become almost almond-shaped. After that, there's just dead air except for a couple of news broadcasts. The first is about a swine flu outbreak, the next is about a train, and the final one, well, the author never says. Stick Stickly. Stick Stickly is a character that hosted Nickelodeon's summer afternoon block from 1995 to 1998, or so they say. According to the narrator, Stick Stickly was actually on TV prior to that, and they weren't sure if they were crazy or not until they found a fan site with clips of his 1993 appearances. The first episode is normal with him cracking some jokes and saying that Rugrats was coming up. The only real difference was that his design was kinda different, with his eyes being smaller and him having no nose. In the next episode, Stick seems a little worn and claims that the dog buried him but that he made it back and got the show everyone wanted to see, Hey Dude. He then tells everyone they can vote for the next show and sings his song about it, but it's slower and in a deeper tone. The next episode had Stick Stickly with a string around his waist. The chalkboard behind him clearly having a game of hangman on it. A kid guessed and every time he was wrong the string moved closer to Stickly's neck. Eventually the letters on the chalkboard were C blank NDLE. The kid thought it'd be funny to guess X and giggled while the string moved up to Stickly's neck. He hung there for a bit with his eyes X'd out before saying that he was fine and that Wild and Crazy Kids was on next. In the next episode, Stickly complained about not being respected, joking but with a more serious tone. A kid comes in and tells Stickly all the kids love him and he decides to stay. He also says that Rugrats is coming on. The next episode he's angry and there's no sound. He screams at a girl cowering in the corner. In the final episode he has a red stain on his head and one of his eyes is an X. He says, it's been a long contest and the vote was close, but you the kids have decided. Coming right now, the classic you voted for, Candle Cove. Cold. Sometimes friends can have conflict. In this special SpongeBob VHS that the narrator gets from a yard sale, SpongeBob and Patrick take this to the next level. The narrator is informed that the episode was supposed to be Reef Blower with actual dialogue instead of the full version we all know. However, when booting up the episode with his little brother, he notices that the title screen says cold, with cobwebs around it and a noose in the background. Of course, this throws him off, but he lets it slide thinking that this was some odd alternate episode. It starts with SpongeBob and Patrick arguing before they get physical. Eventually, SpongeBob and Patrick exchange some very explicit words and storm off. It then shows Patrick sitting in the tub. His arm is a razor blade sitting beside him as he sits in what seems to be a puddle of his own. And you can see more explicit details of Patrick's body. The narrator forces his little brother to leave and continues the episode. Patrick grabs up and heads over to SpongeBob's house, his eyes black voids. After confronting him and pushing him back against the wall, he asks him if he has any last words and SpongeBob insults him one last time before his life is ended. Patrick laughed and the screen went to static before it showed an image of Squidward and Sandy the same way. It then shows a close-up of Patrick's face, his eyes voided out. There's streaming tears in as demonic laughter plays. The screen then flashes and plays static before showing Patrick with a noose. It then shows Patrick looking cold and pale. You could also hear kids screaming in the background. Then the episode ended like normal. Nick was contacted by the narrator's mother and they claimed that they thought the episode was a hoax and that apparently it had been shown 4 times a year for 6 years somewhere in California late at night. 12-ounce mouse, the end of the world. This one's so short I'll read it word for word. The scene is shown where Fitz's house, as shown with the lights off and the TV is on static. Fitz looked seated with his face moldy and noxious, and not smiling with his eyes crusty and stickly. He was watching the static go by on TV. However, when a blustering, eerie, and eccentric heartbeat sound came out in the background music with a scary extended music theme resembling to I Can Lose My Heart Tonight by CC Catch and Out of Touch by Hall & Oates, Mouse started rumbling and started to bawling with his tears crying. He started to yell and scream where a rectangular businessman is shown being by fits. 3 question marks. A bumper came on at night on Nickelodeon claiming that a new SpongeBob episode was about to air. The title card of the episode simply had 3 question marks, which was pretty odd but nothing too crazy. The episode started normally enough, SpongeBob being shown sleeping at first before he gets up and gets dressed and heads to work. Oddly enough, the workday lasted an entire 10 minutes of screen time. After this, SpongeBob heads home clearly tired and sad. A hooded fish confronts him at his house and asks him if he wants to be happy. SpongeBob says yes, and the fish proceeds to inject him with a clear liquid before pushing him into his house. It then switches to SpongeBob in his room, his pupils dilated as leaks from his nose and the injection site on his arm. He then gets up and runs to the living room, proceeding to immediately. After this, he then turns pale and passes away. The screen begins to flash shades of black and green with a smiley face in the middle. SpongeBob then screams, "Do you want to be happy?" And the narrator screams back no, and that he wants him to leave him alone before running away. And then time skips 10 years later, where the narrator says he still can't stop thinking about the episode and is having nightmares about the hooded fish. He has one final question for the viewer. Do you want to be happy? Sunlit Nightmare. John Weldon is a Canadian animator most well known in the US for some of his animations on the O Canada block on Adult Swim. During an alleged period in the 80s where he dealt with some form of narcolepsy, he slowly created a short that he wanted to show to kids. It was called Sunlit Nightmare. Although nearly nobody had seen it outside of some executives, it did air on O Canada once in the summer of 1999. The short began with a black screen and a boy saying about how the dark no longer scared him, but instead it was the light. The nightmares and reality in his head becoming one. It showed a boy in the living room, and everyone was drawn in a squiggly style with presumably a black pen. The boy nervously looks around the room as a voiceover plays. The voiceover states that he used to be afraid of the dark, but one day he fell asleep when the sun was out and had the most horrific nightmare. Ever since then, he's been afraid of the sunlight. Suddenly, a glob of real clay formed behind the couch, morphing and growing into a giant spider. It chased the boy through several rooms of the house before catching him and swallowing him. The next segment was a collection of claymation shapes and figures moving and warping quickly as very slow music played. The boy emerged from one of the shapes and curled up on the ground sobbing. Soon, a yellow beam of sunlight shone on him. He began to sing again. Every day is the exact same thing, the monsters roar and bite and sting. No one is home, no one can help me. I wish I could leave, but outside I see the burning, dry glare, the brightness in the air. I used to fear the dark, but now I'm the only one who had to deal with the endless, hopeless fear of the sun. SpongeBob. Hope is lost. As a Nickelodeon intern, the writer of this story was able to see episodes of SpongeBob before they aired. One such day, he headed into an editor's room that nobody else was in out of curiosity. The door slammed shut behind him, and no matter how much he struggled, he couldn't get out. He was forced to sit down and open the netbook, the only thing inside of the room that was noticeable. There was a blank DVD in the tray. He booted it up and noticed that no program opened, it just kinda started playing. The title card had much different font, much more gothic and horror based. The words on the title card read, "You nosy intern, you shouldn't have come in here." Of course, this only creeped him out more. The text just melted down the screen and opened the episode up. SpongeBob was sleeping in bed while Gary slept on his newspaper beside him. However, SpongeBob wasn't sleeping normally. In fact, he was having a horrific nightmare, as shown as the camera zoomed in on his face, which was twisting into horror and malice. It then showed his dream, the usual bubble transition replaced with fire. The city was destroyed and up in flames, agonized screams of someone roaring throughout the wreckage. Eventually this person is shown to be Patrick, who's nailed to a cross. And he continues to scream as SpongeBob comes up to him before looking down at him. A sense of relief seems to wash over him and he looks at SpongeBob, his eyes pleading for help. Patrick then seems to understand that there is no help and begins to weep softly. Then SpongeBob says, "Suffer, fat one. You, this whole town, brought this upon themselves," and walks away, causing the narrator to scream in horror. More screams played as SpongeBob made his way to the Krusty Krab. A malice-filled laugh played in the background as well. Eventually SpongeBob stops and slowly turns around, his eyes now blood red and full of malice. The narrator now slowly begins to weep. It then shows Patrick, who escaped and crawled to SpongeBob. He asks him to take his suffering away and SpongeBob refuses, saying he will get no divine forgiveness from him before sending him to the underworld. After Patrick screams and disappears, SpongeBob lets out a small giggle before continuing his walk. On the path leading to the Krusty Krab doors, all of the characters are seen on crosses. Their last moments were clearly agony. SpongeBob enters the Krusty Krab and walks to the kitchen, which is glowing red. He meets a demon. One so horrifying, the narrator claims it's more or less incomprehensible. The demon asks SpongeBob if he's made them suffer, and SpongeBob hesitantly replies yes. The demon changes him into his true form, a human, dog-like creature, and kicks him into a portal. The creature mouths to the screen that the narrator's world is next to suffer. The netbook slammed shut and caught on fire before the narrator woke up. A woman named Tina asked him if he was okay, and he responded, and I quote, and yes, I'm serious, this is what they wrote, "Don't thank God on this day. He won't save us. He has abandoned us, his abominations, his failed creations." This caused her to run out screaming. The narrator then claims that he's sitting writing this, of Tina beside him. He then says that he's a messenger of hell itself and that he's coming for the reader and everyone else. Daddy Pig's death. After nearly being hit by a car, the narrator of this story ended up picking up a DVD off of the ground that happened to fly out of the window of said car. It was a pilot video of Peppa Pig. The episode was of course titled Daddy Pigs. It starts with Peppa in her room playing with toys. Mommy and Daddy Pig come upstairs to check on her. Then Daddy Pig feels a pain in his stomach, and it begins to expand. It expands to the point that everyone, and soon graphically, it shows some of the graphic aftermath, and the show ends. The narrator smashes the DVD up so that nobody else will be able to see it. Never, Never. An odd episode of regular show appeared with the title Never, Never. It starts with Mordecai and Rigby in the woods. Rigby dares Mordecai to climb a rock, and Mordecai does it unsuccessfully, slipping and landing on his butt. Rigby shines a flashlight into his eyes and asks if he's okay, and Mordecai frustratingly swears, which weirded out the narrator. Suddenly, a woman pops out of the bushes with an M9 and begins to fire into the air. Rigby and Mordecai have an altercation with her before Rigby finally gets the weapon and uses it on her. Unluckily, he ends up hitting Mordecai as well, ending his life. The time skips to 2 years later, where he's dancing with a woman in the club. They were telling stories, and she ended up revealing that she was the assassin that attacked them. Rigby freaks out and attempts to end her life, but fails again. A time skips to 10 years later, and Rigby is in the house with some of his kids. He has a picture of Mordecai framed on a table, and one of the kids asks him who that is and what happened to him. Rigby tells them that he's his best friend who's passed, and that he would have loved him like an uncle. Suddenly, someone appears at the door that looks like a young version of Mordecai. Rigby says that Mordecai left one down there for him and thanks him, and then says that he misses him. Son. At a local resale store, the narrator finds a Brian Time lost episode tape. This tape has a horribly misspelled label showing that it was already a crude production. The episode started and the animation was extremely unstable and nauseating. The sound was distorted and the screen flickered. The title card finally came up and it said, Son. The episode started odd with Brian looking unhappy before he says, Ugh, a stupidly stupid day here. It was drawn very, very badly with little to no detail. The animation switched at this point. For around 10 minutes everything stopped and then a picture popped up that, and I quote, will give you nightmares for 1,000 years. According to the author, it was a picture of Brian, his eyes bloodshot and smiling menacingly. This went on for 5 minutes. The narrator says that they don't want to say too much more about the episode, but that it shows the sky changing from blue to the same texture of the picture in the background. They then ended by saying that they would definitely have nightmares after this. Kelda drinks a micropixel of orange juice and straight up. I checked multiple subreddits, Wattpad, several wikis of Creepypasta, troll pasta, funny pasta, every type of pasta, so if you have any idea if this is even real or if I'm just missing the joke, let everyone know in the comments because I really don't know what this is from. Also, even just looking up Kelda shows Norse mythology stuff, so I don't even know what show this could be referring to. 44 Cats, Meatball's Wrath. After a DVD falls from the narrator's roof, they notice that it's an episode of 44 Cats, a kids show. Immediately, they noticed something was wrong as the intro only had Meatball in it, and the background was all red. The title of the episode was Meatball's Wrath, which the narrator also found very odd. It begins with Meatball crying in the corner of the garage until Lampo comes in and asks Meatball what's wrong. Meatball tells Lampo that they're a victim and asks them if they have any last words. Lampo, confused, doesn't have time to react before their life is taken by Meatball. Meatball then continues to do the same to the other cats in an extremely graphic fashion using a chainsaw, an AK-47, and even an RPG. He then finally takes himself out and the credits roll. The credits had a gray blank chalkboard and only Meatball was there holding a knife and it says created by nobody at the bottom. The narrator then says that they smashed the DVD and contacted the creators of 44 Cats. Carl Carlson's death. One day while walking along, the narrator just happened to find a VHS tape on the ground of The Simpsons, one of their favorite shows. They go home and start the episode up, which begins normally enough. Homer was at Moe's drinking beer and Carl said that he was going to fly to Canada to see his folks. It cuts to the next scene where Homer is watching TV on the couch and a woman knocks at the door. She tells Homer that Carl has passed away in a plane crash and Homer wails before breaking down into tears, much more pain than how he typically would. It then changes to a funeral scene, Lenny crying as they pay their respects to Carl. It then shows everyone crying and fades out. The final picture is that of Carl's before the episode ends. The narrator claims to have researched the episode and has found out that the animator's mom had passed, prompting them to make an episode. There were only 2 copies and he just happened to stumble upon one of them. He ended up destroying his tape so that he wouldn't have to see it again. Evil Zooter. Jungle Junction was a Disney kids show involving animals that rolled around on wheels. Zooter is a pig character from the show. The narrator claims that they used to work for Disney and got a copy of this episode to review. The intro played at a bit of a lower pitch and the characters had hyper-realistic eyes. After the intro, the title card had Bungo holding up a sign that said Evil Zooter with a sad look on his face. Sad piano music played in the background as the episode began. Zooter was crying and asked why they would do this to her. They eventually show that she has injuries and pitch black eyes and red pupils along with sharp teeth. She says that it's time in a demonic voice and picks up an axe. Her first victim is Crocker, whose garden she burns up before doing the same to him. Next is Taxi Crab, who gets his eyes by hedge clippers. Then Bungo gets caught and Zooter uses a noose on him. Zooter then goes to the hospital and gets Toadhog and Lance before going to the school and taking out Miss Jolly and the students. She then goes to the police station and gets Bobby before finishing off Dozer at his house. Zooter then looks at the camera and tells the kids that they can try too if they want, before ending her own life. On the end credits, the sky was black and the music played backwards. The narrator destroys the disc. Pretty much the rest of Gosha's Lost Episode Wiki. This is the wiki where the majority of Lost Episode creepypasta are located, although I can say from researching this video, definitely not all of them. You'll be able to find some really interesting stories here, a lot of which weren't covered, so definitely check that out. Well, with that, this is the end of the Iceberg. This was a really long one, but I'm definitely glad to have finished it and to be able to say that this is the longest Iceberg I've successfully done. Hopefully it's pretty good, and I also hope you personally enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications if you're ready for more. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good day.